the land of the United States has been the scene of many challenges and glories. This video traces the history of how the United States became a world superpower from colonial times to the present day. Please enjoy this story of vast nature, diverse cultures, and turbulent history. Chapter 1: The Birth of the American Colonies. The history of the United States began with European immigration at the end of the 16th century. In 1607, the English established Jamestown, Virginia, which became the first permanent English colony. European immigrants came to the area in search of religious freedom and economic opportunity. However, there were conflicts between the settlers and the native peoples, who lost their land and in some cases their lives. During the American colonial period, different economic bases developed in the North and South. In the North, small-scale agriculture and fishing were practiced, and labor by freedmen predominated. In the South, large-scale plantation agriculture developed, growing crops such as tobacco and cotton. This southern economy was supported by the many slaves brought from Africa. The colonies were controlled by European powers such as England, France, Spain, and the Netherlands. Economic activity in the colonies developed through the triangular trade, which closely linked America, Africa, and Europe. Britain established 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard and increased its control. Cooperation and competition developed among the colonies, and a sense of independence gradually grew. Conflict between Britain and France over possession of the colonies intensified, leading to the 7 Years' War. As a result of the 7 Years' War, Britain acquired vast territories from France and established its dominance in North America. However, to cover the costs of the war, the British began to impose heavy taxes on the colonies, which would later lead to the Revolutionary War. Chapter 2: The Road to American Independence. After the 7 Years' War, the British government adopted a policy of imposing new taxes on the colonies to cover war costs. The Stamp Act of 1765 and the Tea Act of 1773 placed a heavy burden on the colonists. This led to strong opposition among the colonists and widespread protests. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 was a symbolic event that escalated protests against the British government. In 1774, representatives of the colonies gathered for the First Continental Congress. They expressed their desire for independence by boycotting British products. In 1775, fighting at Lexington and Concord led to the outbreak of the Revolutionary War. The 13 colonies sought independence from Great Britain and adopted the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776. Drafted by Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration espoused the principles of equality and freedom. The war was initially difficult for the colonists, but this changed when France came to their aid. Following France, Spain and the Netherlands joined the American side in supporting the fight. In 1781, the Colonial Army won the Battle of Yorktown, and the British decided not to continue the war. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, officially recognized the independence of the United States. After independence, the 13 states of the United States formed a confederation and laid the foundation for a new nation. The U.S. Constitution of 1787 established a strong central government and set up a unified nation. Chapter 3: Western Settlement and Territorial Expansion. After the American Revolution, Western expansion became a major national agenda. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson purchased Louisiana from France, greatly expanding the territory. This purchase of Louisiana marked the beginning of Western exploration. Later, the Lewis and Clark expedition surveyed the untamed Western lands to explore their potential for settlement. The United States annexed Texas in 1845 and incorporated it as a state. It further divided the territory with Great Britain by the Treaty of Oregon in 1846, establishing control of the Northwest. As a result of the Mexican-American War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed in 1848, annexing California and New Mexico to the United States. Gold was discovered in California in 1848, and many people flocked to the gold rush. This accelerated migration to the west, and the U.S. territory rapidly expanded westward. However, this led to serious conflicts with native peoples, and many of them were forcibly relocated. The Indian Removal Act forced the migration of indigenous peoples to lands west of the Mississippi River, forcing them to undergo severe relocation. As Western settlement progressed, economic and social conflicts between the North and South also became apparent. The South had a predominantly agricultural economy dependent on slavery, while the North was becoming more industrialized. In the 1850s, conflicts over slavery intensified and the threat of national division increased. These conflicts would eventually lead to the Civil War. Chapter 4: The Civil War and the Reconstruction Era. In 1860, after Abraham Lincoln was elected president, the Southern states declared their secession from the United States. The South formed the Confederate States of America and took a stronger stance against the federal government. In 1861, the Civil War broke out following the battle at Fort Sumter. The war was the most violent in U.S. history, resulting in the loss of more than 600,000 lives. While the Union armies fought the war on the strength of their industrial and population advantages, the Confederacy was backed by geographical superiority and superior leadership. In 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, positioning the cause of the war as emancipation. With the Battle of Gettysburg as a turning point, Union forces gradually gained the upper hand while Confederate forces were on the defensive. In 1865, a general Union offensive finally led to the surrender of the Confederacy and the end of the Civil War. Although the end of the war marked the official abolition of slavery throughout the United States, Reconstruction in the South was extremely difficult. During Reconstruction, the economic recovery of the South and the guarantee of rights for freed blacks became important issues. In 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was enacted, completely abolishing slavery in the United States. However, discrimination against blacks still persisted in the South, and white supremacist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan emerged. With the end of Reconstruction, racial segregation policies known as Jim Crow laws prevailed in the South, and black rights were once again curtailed. The South would suffer economic difficulties and racial tensions for a long time, and it took time for the United States as a whole to unify. Overcoming these difficulties, the United States once again came together as one nation and began to move toward a new era. Chapter 5: The Industrial Revolution and Imperialism. In the second half of the 19th century, the United States experienced rapid industrialization, and the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. With the expansion of the railroad network and the development of the oil industry, the U.S. economy grew by leaps and bounds. Mass production and the introduction of new technologies led to urbanization and the influx of many immigrants into the United States. During this period, the U.S. transformed from an agriculturally oriented nation into an industrial powerhouse. As its economic power grew, the U.S. strengthened its international presence. In the 1890s, imperialistic policies were adopted and overseas territories were acquired. During the Spanish-American War of 1898, the U.S. acquired Cuba, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico, expanding its influence quickly. Hawaii was also annexed in 1898, giving the U.S. a strategic base in the Pacific. The U.S. was also involved in the construction of the Panama Canal and played an important role in world shipping. In the early 20th century, the U.S. emerged as a major world economic power and established itself internationally. Domestically, however, worsening working conditions and social inequalities became problems, and the labor movement gained momentum. In World War I, which broke out in 1914, the United States, which had initially remained neutral, entered the war in 1917 and fought on the side of the Allies. After the war, the U.S. led the establishment of the League of Nations, but due to the isolationist climate in the country, the U.S. decided not to officially join the organization. The Roaring Twenties of the 1920s saw rapid economic growth and cultural prosperity. However, the Great Depression, triggered by the Wall Street crash of 1929, dealt a severe blow to the U.S. economy. Chapter 6: World War II and the Beginning of the Cold War. When World War II broke out in 1939, the United States initially declared its neutrality. However, following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the United States decided to enter the war as an allied power. The U.S. contributed greatly to the victory of the war, backed by its overwhelming supply capabilities and military power. In 1945, the war ended in Allied victory with the surrender of Germany on the European front and Japan on the Pacific front. With the conclusion of the war, the United States established its leadership position in the world. After the war, the United States promoted the establishment of the United Nations and took an active role in maintaining world peace. Immediately after the war, however, the Cold War broke out between the United States and the Soviet Union, dividing the world into capitalist and communist camps. The U.S. provided economic aid to Western European countries and promoted the Marshall Plan to prevent the spread of communism. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization NATO was formed, and the United States and Western European countries established a joint defense system. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union established communist regimes in Eastern European countries, establishing a Cold War structure. In the US, there was a period of red hunting and suppression of communists and suspected communists. In the 1950s, the nuclear arms race between the US and the Soviet Union intensified, raising the threat of nuclear war. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted and tensions between the two countries reached a peak, bringing the world to the brink of nuclear war. However, the crisis was averted through negotiations between President John F. Kennedy and Prime Minister Nikita Khrushchev. During this Cold War era, the United States used its military and diplomatic power to maintain its world leadership. Chapter 7: Modern America and its Challenges. With the end of the Cold War, the United States established itself as the sole superpower. However, even after the Cold War, the United States faced the threat of conflict and terrorism in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and other regions. In particular, the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks had a serious impact on the United States. This incident prompted the U.S. to launch military interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq under the banner of the War on Terrorism. However, these wars were protracted, and the U.S. was subjected to much criticism both at home and abroad. The U.S. also faces many challenges such as economic disparity, racial issues, and immigration policy within the country. The global financial crisis of 2008 dealt a major blow to the U.S. economy and caused global economic instability. In response to this crisis, the U.S. government has promoted economic reforms and reaffirmed the importance of international cooperation. In recent years, the rise of new powers such as China and Russia has tested the U.S. international influence. In particular, trade wars with China and military confrontations in the South China Sea have had a major impact on the international community. The United States is also actively addressing global issues such as climate change and nuclear proliferation. At the same time, domestic political conflicts and divisions are deepening, and the foundations of democracy are shaking. The question is, what kind of leadership will the U.S. demonstrate in the international community in the future? The challenge to build a sustainable future through new technological innovations and international cooperation continues. As the world becomes increasingly multipolar, the U.S. is called upon to conduct a flexible and comprehensive foreign policy. The history of the United States has been one of constant change and challenge. And that progress continues to this day. The baton is being passed to the next generation with the lessons and hopes nurtured throughout our history. What path will we choose for the future of this vast country? It is in the hands of each and every one of us. If you enjoyed this video, please visit our channel.